We're going to give another minute for people to assemble, and we're going to get the Leaders in Housing Counseling calls started. We'll talk to you in a moment. Welcome, everybody, to the Leaders in Housing Counseling call. We're glad to have you on. We've got a crowded agenda today, so we're going to dive right in. We have Julia Gordon from the Center for American Progress, and we have Jane Duong from the National Capacity, both as guests, each with their own presentation. Should be very good stuff. We're going to do a quick set of updates, very quick, to just bring you up to date on issues that we're working on that have immediate relevance, and then we're going to dive into the presentations. So as we all know, federal funding for housing counseling has been a struggle this year. In the House, they lowballed our numbers as they did the entire transportation and HUD budget under the Ryan budget. And so under that program, we have $35 million for HUD this year, $58 million for NFMC, way below where we've been in the past. The Senate numbers are much better. They've followed what the President's recommendation were and what we were asking for. So $55 million for HUD and $77 million for NFMC. And the latest word is that the THUD budget, the transportation and HUD budget, which contains of these numbers on the Senate side, is going to the floor on Tuesday, and we'll go for a vote. We're encouraging a yes vote on that, and we're waiting to see what will happen in the House. We are encouraging House members not to support the bill at the current funding levels, and asking the leadership to support the Senate numbers instead. And so we'll keep you informed on that. This will probably be an issue that will run through the summer and into the fall as we go step by step. Please contact Matthew on our staff about the latest details, and especially if you're talking to House Republicans, where we really need to make some headway. And thanks for the work you're doing there. A couple other quick points on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Richard Cordray has been nominated successfully, and got the vote to be confirmed as the director of the CFPB, which is a major step forward for us as housing consumers and advocates for housing consumers. This is very good news, and I know some of you out there did work to support this, and it's all paid off. Very good news going forward. One other thing that we did a little bit of work on, actually did a fair amount of work on, was on the Civil Penalties Fund. So the CFPB will be suing institutions around financial fraud issues. They're going to create a fund which will pay for consumer education and financial literacy. And there was a comment period that came due on Monday. We stepped in to this wasn't widely known, so there weren't that many comments that went in. We stepped in to really clearly say that those funds should be used specifically for educating consumers through one-on-one counseling and to support housing counseling. And I think there's a lot of money floating around for generalized education, but for really helping people on working on their specific cases and their specific financial situations. We all know there's a big lack of funding. This will be steady money. We don't know how big it will be, but it will be an opportunity to really lay the groundwork for what we hope will be a substantial flow of support for the kind of work that really needs to get done in our communities. So this is one we'll bird dog all the way through, and we'll keep you informed. The HAMP reform sign-on letter We had 140 groups sign on. 100 of them were housing counseling agencies, 100 plus. So we did a really nice job on that piece. And we're going to be starting the conversation with Treasury. This was under the auspices of the Americans for Financial Reform. A lot of housing advocates and housing counselors contributed to the list of what we think ought to be done on HAMP to improve it. This is only the beginning of a conversation, but we've engaged with senior people at Treasury, and a lot of groups will be involved in trying to get them to make changes in the program that will hopefully get us better resolutions going forward. The one other very interesting conversation we had was around lost documents and this whole issue, why does this go away? HUD asked us to just ask the National Housing Resource Center why we thought this continued to be a problem as part of their conversation with the Attorney Generals and I think the monitoring team. That conversation we thought was pretty important, ended up putting this, we had a call about it, we circulated some ideas. We've had a very vibrant conversation this past week on the lost documents issues, and I've learned a lot. This has been very helpful. I appreciate the fact that everybody's been so specific about what the problems are. We've now converted this into a sheet that we did the first version and we sent to HUD on Monday. We're going to do a second expanded version. We're going to not only circulate that to HUD, but we're going to give it to Treasury, to the OCC, the Federal Reserve, and the Attorneys General. And we hope that this will help trigger some investigations and improvements in resolutions. Some of the stuff will probably turn over to servicers and to the Hope Loanport people too, to see if they can be helpful in fixing some of these things. But this was a good education for me. I really appreciate all that you've done on this, and we will try to take some other issues and do a deep dive. And using the listserv seemed to be very effective in this particular situation. So all very good. It's been a productive week, and we have a lot more coming up in front of us. But what we'd like to do is move now to our presentations. And just let me make sure, is Julia Gordon on? Matthew?
Julia was having some trouble. It looks like she's on. Can you hear us, Julia? I think she's just maybe a minute behind.
Okay, so I'm going to do the intro, and hopefully we'll connect with Julia easily. So in the complicated world of housing affordability and the whole reforming of the housing finance system, Julia has been one of our champions in really working for a fairer, much more accessible system that doesn't discriminate against the people that we work with, and really trying to figure out how to make affordability work in this atmosphere. She's worked with the Legal Services, with the Center for Responsible Lending, with FHFA, and now she's at the Center for American Progress. She's been involved with a lot of the key issues that have affected our work and housing affordability. She was deeply involved in Dodd-Frank and in much of trying to improve HAMP and other programs like that. I mean, one of her gifts is that she can take complex issues and find practical and understandable solutions, as we're going to see in this conversation today. And we're going to
I'm on.
Yay!
I'm here.
Nice work. Good. Okay, good. So just before you dive in, if people have questions or thoughts they want to share, they should put them in the chat box on their screen and send in, and we'll take a few minutes to take questions. So right now, well, let me say one more quick thing, just so everybody's got the vocabulary. So there's a lot of debate about GSE reform. So GSE is the government-sponsored enterprises. What that really means right now is it's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So so we will probably use the phrase GSE, but what we're talking about is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and whatever replaces it. So Julia, many of the counselors on this call have commented on how hard it is for home buyers to qualify for a mortgage. what's happening with efforts to reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and how is it going to make it easier for people to get mortgages in the future?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on your call. I am going to answer that I'm going to talk about two different areas of work, or two different types of policy decisions that are being made right now at the federal level. First, as folks know, Fannie and Freddie are still very much in existence. And in fact, from the time 5 years ago where they were essentially bankrupt and ended up bailed out by the taxpayer to the tune of close to $200 billion, they've really turned things around quite a bit and are now making a bunch of money, which they are now sending to Treasury, and they are still doing what they've always done. And what it is that they've always done is, you guys are all on the front lines of people getting mortgages from lenders in what's called the primary lending market. The on-the-ground place where individuals go to get money to buy a house with. Fannie and Freddie are what's called the secondary market, which means, if Bank of America makes a loan, Fannie and Freddie can buy that loan from Bank of America, give Bank of America more money so Bank of America can make more loans. That's the basic operation of the secondary market. And then in fairly recent times, the last few decades, what Fannie and Freddie have done with those loans is not just hold them on their balance sheet, but bundle them up into mortgage-backed securities, and then they sell shares, they sell those securities to investors, pension funds or whoever wants to hold shares in what's considered to be like an extremely safe security. So right now, both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are under the control of a federal agency called the Federal Housing Finance Agency, or FHFA. Not everybody has heard of FHFA, but most of us who work in this space have heard of FHFA's director, Ed DeMarco, who has been the topic of controversy from time to time. FHFA right now has something close to complete control over the decisions that Fannie and Freddie make. And now I'm going to get around to the answer to Bruce's question, which is, how do we get people more access to credit than they have now? And in a way, that agency, FHFA, holds the key to this right now, because they do two things. They set the parameters of the credit box. They decide, what underwriting requirements a borrower has to meet, what credit scores they need, what incomes they need, what ratios there are kind of behind the scenes, what compensating factors there are. They get to decide all that. And the other thing they get to decide is how the relationship between Fannie and Freddie and the lenders in the primary market is working. Because one thing that happens is when the lenders are really scared of Fannie and Freddie and scared that they're going to get in trouble with Fannie and Freddie, and that Fannie and Freddie are going to say, I don't like this loan, I'm going to make you buy it back. When lenders are scared of that, they don't lend as much. For the many decades leading up to the housing crisis, that sort of thing almost never happened. If Fannie bought the mortgage, Fannie kept the mortgage. But after the housing crisis and all the defaults we saw and all the foreclosures we saw, Fannie and Freddie, who were under a lot of pressure to pay the taxpayer back, tried to basically get the lenders to indemnify them, saying, you, Mr. Lender, sold me crappy loans, and they didn't meet the criteria that we had said they had to meet in order for us to buy them, so we are going to make you buy them back. Ha. And so that's really what's underlying a lot of the tight credit today, is not just what Fannie and Freddie will buy, kind of the outside limits of what they'll buy, but lenders being extremely cautious and not even going to the limits of what Fannie and Freddie technically allow because they're worried about getting in trouble later. So that whole situation is essentially controlled right now by FHFA. So that's half the answer to Bruce's question. The other half of the answer is, while all this stuff is going on with FHFA, Congress and lots of other folks out there are thinking long term, and they're thinking, well, nobody likes Fannie and Freddie anymore. They needed to be bailed out. Lots of people, I think largely incorrectly, but lots of people blame them for the housing crisis. And there's a great desire to get rid of Fannie and Freddie and to create a whole new housing finance system from scratch, a whole new secondary market system from scratch. And that's what we talk about when we refer to GSE reform. Even though FHFA is actually doing GSE reform every day, when you hear about GSE reform in the media, it's really talking about if Congress just totally throws out Fannie and Freddie and starts from scratch. Until now, not a whole lot of people have been paying a lot of attention to this issue. It sounds technical. The vast majority of people in this country don't know what the secondary mortgage market is. We have a lot of other priorities that are drawing attention at the federal level these days, from the budget crisis and the sequester to big legislation like immigration. So there hasn't been a whole lot of attention paid to this, but the fact is it's really, really important. Obviously, it's incredibly important to everybody on this phone call because this is the industry you're in and because your clients want to be able to buy houses. But it's really important to everybody because the secondary market, although it sounds technical, that is really what determines who can buy a house and how many of us can buy a house. And it also determines whether other people are going to offer affordable rental housing. So this is not just an issue that's important to people interested in home ownership. It's really important to anybody who wants affordable shelter of any kind across the whole country, across all geographies. Because of the lack of, or at least in part because of the lack of sort of public engagement in this issue, so far the conversation at the federal level about these topics is extremely dominated by Wall Street, by investors, by people who see the housing market as a place that they put their money in order to get a good return on their money, a good return on their investment. That's, of course, a lot of domestic investors, but also international investors, China and South America, and whatever places around the globe have a lot of cash, they're looking for the best place to put that cash to get the biggest return on it. And until the housing crisis, the American housing market was a really popular place to get a good return on your money. So the folks who really want this asset class back are very interested in the topic. And of course, the industry trades, realtors, home builders, mortgage bankers, obviously they're extremely interested in this and have a very big dog in the fight. So those are the voices that have been at the table so far, which is resulting in a conversation that's very oriented toward Wall Street rather than Main Street. And one of the reasons I'm so glad that Bruce asked me to be on this call is because I think all of us have a really important role to play in making sure that everybody knows that this conversation is occurring and that it's really, really important to Main Street. It's really important to individuals and families who own a home, who would like to someday own a home, who own a home and think that someday they'd like to sell their home. What happens in this kind of abstruse debate about the secondary market is going to determine all of that. And it's going to determine in the future whether access to credit is something broadly available to different kinds of people who live in different geographies, who might be buying different types of houses or, smaller, less expensive houses. All of those things are going to be determined by what happens both in the congressional decisions about the post-Fannie Freddie future, and in the meantime, by the decisions that FHFA makes right now. I'm going to stop there, Bruce, and you can kind of direct me.
We do have one question. Should I throw that out now?
Yeah,
or?
okay, let's do that.
So the first question we have is if you could please talk about the role of affordable housing goals in the GSEs, and then the impact of similar provisions not being included in the proposed reforms such as Carter-Warner.
Great question. Of course, that's a central question to everything I've been saying so far. So in their charters, Fannie and Freddie have requirements to serve essentially a public purpose or a public mission. And that mission includes making sure that they adequately support lending to lower income families. There's been a particular mechanism in place for many years to help encourage them to do that. And that's what the affordable housing goals are. They are exactly what they sound like, that Fannie and Freddie are supposed to make, a certain number of loans in certain areas and to certain categories of borrowers in order to make sure that Fannie and Freddie are fulfilling that public purpose. They also have another obligation that was established just before the housing crisis, or around the time the housing crisis was starting, and has really never been put into effect, which you may have heard of, called the duty to serve, which is an even more targeted requirement that Fannie and Freddie serve certain rural areas, certain types of housing like manufactured housing that can also be hard to get financing for, and the like. And that requirement has never been implemented through regulation because the FHFA has chosen not to implement it. Most of the various interests that are at the table now for this housing finance discussion take as a given or make as a condition that the affordable housing goals will be removed. We won't recreate those goals in a new system. The reason for that is the extremely mistaken belief that somehow the goals caused the crisis. There's a narrative out there, an incorrect but very powerful narrative about how the government forced Fannie and Freddie to make loans to risky borrowers, and as a result, we crashed the housing market. Now, I'm guessing everybody on this phone knows that's not really how it played out, that in fact the risky loans that crashed the market were the private label loans. They were the predatory subprime loans, the hybrid ARMs, the negatively amortizing loans, and the failure to underwrite properly for loans, the no-doc loans, and all of that. But the narrative about the affordable housing goals is a very appealing narrative, particularly to conservatives, but honestly not just to conservatives. And it also sort of plays into the overall conservative attack on quotas of any sort in any sector. And so the bills, the congressional legislation that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate eliminates the goals. So then the question is, what do you get instead of the goals? For those who are advocating a purely private market solution with no government involvement, and which is the bill that's been introduced in the House of Representatives, the answer to that question is nothing. You don't replace them. Whatever, the market will do whatever it does, and because markets are perfect in every way, they will, of course, serve every creditworthy borrower out there, no matter where they are or what they look like. I think we all know that that's not the case, but that's the argument. The legislation that's been introduced in the Senate comes up with a partial scheme to replace the goals, which is charging a fee for securitizations that would go into a fund, and the fund would then be used, or a series of funds, would then be used to support home ownership and affordable rental creation through credit enhancements or other kinds of grant programs or piloting different kinds of innovative products. What neither legislation has in them is the same overall public purpose or mission to serve even the hard-to-serve parts of the market. And that is, right now, to us, the scariest thing about the conversation that's happening in Washington is this apparent lack of commitment, even if the government is involved in the system, to saying, well, if the government is backing the system, the government has an obligation to make sure that those who will be profiting from the system are serving everybody.
Yeah,
does that answer that question?
Yeah, that's good. And I think NCRC has put together an educational last week, and we circulated a link to some of the information they had on what the cost of losing the goals would be. So that's very helpful. And
yeah, I will say that the NCRC math on the cost of losing the goals, while losing the goals is a very big deal, particularly from the perspective of losing the purpose of the goals, this is another place where the FHFA comes in, which is that every year the FHFA, which has control over the goals, makes the goals smaller, and most of the housing being counted toward the goals is probably not the type of thing we might think it should be. A lot of it is just kind of plain vanilla stuff to borrowers who just happen to live in areas that count toward the goals. So the numbers are a little bit misleading. What's the most important part is the purpose of the goals and the purpose of the whole system being to house people who live in this country, as opposed to being just a more profitable asset class for investors.
So Julie, what do you think are practical things that, I mean, we're talking to a broad range of counselors all across the United States right now. What are practical things that they should be thinking about doing to help influence this conversation?
Sure. Well, the first thing is I I know everybody out there in the housing counseling community knows how effective housing counseling can be to reduce risk in individual mortgages and to help homeowners maintain sustainable homeownership. And I think it's very important to be making that case to everybody who's involved in revamping the system, because it will be possible to build into the new system, and frankly possible to build into the existing system if we go that way, a much more central role for housing counseling. I know that in the Senate bill, in the fund that I was talking about that is there to support credit enhancement and the like, one of the proposed uses for that fund would be to support an effort to figure out how best to integrate housing counseling more centrally into our whole loan-making process. But the House bill is very antagonistic toward housing counseling, and I think generally speaking, even though the experts in this field are well acquainted with counseling and the benefits of it, the legislators who are just starting to get involved in this conversation, and some of them aren't the same ones who were the most involved in the foreclosure conversations, really need to be educated about what is housing counseling, what does it do, and in particular, how does that connect to the overall system and the level of risk in the overall system and the ultimate cost of credit to home buyers.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we're really trying to figure out is how that the financial services community can look at housing counseling as a risk mitigator and kind of value that in the cost of money, value that in the underwriting, value that in the funding of housing counseling, so that people who have been counseled can get better loans, more affordable loans, and can have a little bit larger credit risk box.
Well, and what's especially important about housing counseling is it's one of the only ways to reduce risk that doesn't involve making either a higher down payment or making the credit box smaller or causing someone to have to purchase insurance of some kind. So, in this whole secondary market discussion, there's lots of talk about down payments, lots of talk about mortgage insurance, but very little talk about what are the other things that reduce risk, and that's where the housing counseling conversation needs to go.
Absolutely. Well, that's what we're going to be working on, and Julia, thank you so much. We'll have you again probably this fall to really try to help us figure out more what we should be doing around these questions about access to credit and changing the the housing finance system. Thanks so much for all your good work, and we will continue to work with you.
Do we have time for one more quick question or no?
Okay, one really quick one. Yeah, sure.
So basically, there was a report on NPR this morning that the Democrats may be introducing legislation that's going to incorporate some of what worked at Fannie and Freddie, and that Corker Warner might be hitting some roadblocks. Can you comment on that, or is that something you've heard?
So there are other senators, in particular led by Senator Reid, who have kind of a different approach to revamping the housing finance system than the Corker Warner bill does. And those senators are trying to figure out whether to introduce new legislation right now. We haven't seen that draft legislation, but it is likely more along the lines of essentially making Fannie and Freddie private companies again, kind of as a transition step, and then probably transitioning to something that doesn't look that different from Corker Warner. Some of this, I don't want to go on too long, but some of this debate has to do with the fact that when Treasury bailed out Fannie and Freddie, they basically put themselves in a senior position with regard to being a shareholder. And people who had held previous shares in Fannie and Freddie as companies before the crisis, as well as the speculators who have purchased Fannie and Freddie stock, at kind of, incredibly low prices since then, those shareholders are making a big bid to get paid off, which could happen if Fannie and Freddie were returned to private hands. I think there's going to be a lot of debate about that because the Fannie and Freddie brands are pretty severely damaged. But the more general thing I'll say is I don't anticipate that any of the exact bills being introduced this session are likely to make it all the way to the President's desk simply because the House of Representatives is just too far away now. They are not in a place to have a bipartisan bill on anything, let alone on this topic. So even though I think the Senate is really getting ready to work on this, I don't think we're seeing this happen before the 2014 elections, but it demonstrates that this is the exact time for voices like yours to get into the conversation because people are paying attention, yet it's not like, it's not like there's going to be a bill in the next month that's suddenly going to land on the President's desk. So it's the ideal time for involvement. For folks who want to stay involved in this conversation more on a regular basis, not only do I suggest you read the paper we did that Bruce has sent around to you, but we do have regular biweekly calls with a group of advocates who are trying to organize around these issues. And if you're interested, I mean, I know you guys have lots of other things to do, but anyone who's interested in coming to those calls, even just occasionally, feel free to get my email address from Bruce and let me know.
Good, we'll do that. Thank you so much, Julia. We'll stay in touch.
All right, thanks.
We'll have luck. Great.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right. So next we have Jane Duong from National Capacity, and I hope all of you are familiar with National Capacity. One of the great things about National Capacity is that it not only is an effective advocate for the Asian and Pacific Islander community, but also they work kind of broadly in the things that they do, and I've really been impressed with when they're in the room that they deal with issues that affect our entire industry as well as to the people they are directly advocating for. So a couple examples on language access. They have shown a lot of leadership about really trying to push for increased language access and not just for the Asian and Pacific Islanders communities who have a very specific set of issues, but have also always thought about it in a much broader context for everybody that might have a language issue. And similarly, I know working with Jane, one of the issues that came up that they found in their community was around rental counseling, which is a not as respected form of counseling as homeownership counseling in the HUD world, and they've really tried to elevate the issue that things need to be changed in the HUD handbook and re-guided to make rental counseling more of an equal form of counseling in the industry. So I think they've really helped raise the conversation on all kinds of these issues. And the Asian and Pacific Islander populations are the fastest growing population in the United States, which is why it's important for us to start understanding and being more connected with what their issues are. I think more and more of us are going to start seeing these populations in our work, and we need to get skilled and familiar with what the issues are that are coming in front of us. So Jane, tell us what we should know.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce, for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me present today on some of the issues impacting Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, as well as Native Hawaiians. So as Bruce mentioned, I'm the Director of Programs and Advocacy with National Capacity, and the acronym stands for the Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. We've been around for about 13 years, and our mission is to be a powerful voice for the unique community development needs of API communities and to strengthen the capacity of community-based organizations to create neighborhoods of hope and opportunity. And we're membership-based with organizations across the country, including housing counseling, community development corporations, affordable housing orgs, human service organizations, and community organizing organizations. And we're all joined together with this shared commitment towards equity and social justice. So today I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of APIs and economic need and the housing crisis, and talk a little bit about some of the resources that we have within our housing counseling network, and wrap up a little bit with opportunities for collaboration and action. If we could go to the next slide. So as Bruce mentioned, APIs are one of the fastest growing communities in the U.S. population. We now represent about 6% of the overall population and are the fastest racial group in the United States, growing by about 46% in the last decade compared to only 10% growth in the U.S. population overall. But less discussed is the growth of APIs living in poverty that has also grown in the past decade, and I will focus the rest of the data in my presentation on APIs living in poverty. So in this graph you can see that our poverty population has actually reached 2 million in 2011, growing by over 500,000 in just the last 4 years. So the big message here is that APIs living in poverty is increasing, and definitely more so than most people realize. And our focus on poverty, we know, is a limited indicator, but certainly an important indicator that is a reflection of greater economic need that is growing in our communities. And on the next slide, you'll see that in the wake of the recession, API poverty has increased by 38%, and this is compared to a 27% increase for the general poverty population overall in the U.S. Only Hispanics at 42% had a larger percentage increase in their poverty population. And on the next slide, you can see that the general API population is certainly really diverse. So the census identifies over 20 ethnic categories that are part of the overall umbrella that we call API. And the largest of these poverty populations is that of non-Taiwanese Chinese at approximately 450,000. And among all ethnic groups, the Hmong, Bangladeshi, and Tongan communities have some of the highest poverty rates. And on the next slide, you can see that API poor are also concentrated in few distinct metropolitan areas. And we see that the top 10 metropolitan statistical areas actually contain about 50% of the AAPI poor population in the country. And actually, the top 3 metropolitan statistical areas, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, actually house over 30% of the AAPI poverty population. This isn't to say that the API population is not growing in other parts of the country, which it certainly is, but this is where the growth of those living in greater economic need are growing the fastest. And I think what's really key to our conversation around housing is on the next slide, is that APIs are living in poverty are also disproportionately concentrated in high housing cost regions. So you can see from this chart that 47% of Asian Americans and 40% of Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders are living in high housing cost regions compared to the 17% of the U.S. total population overall. overall. Clearly from the last slide, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, also Honolulu have some of the highest housing costs in the country, and that's where most of the API population actually lives. So those statistics make sense. And so what this tells us is that AAPIs tend to be living in extremely high housing cost burdens, are more likely to be severely impacted by declining house values in the wake of the housing crisis, or completely priced out of homeownership opportunities altogether. So on this next slide, unfortunately in the foreclosure crisis, the true extent of the foreclosure crisis is often masked by the lack of data. So right now in this chart you can see this is census data of U.S. homeownership rates between 2008 and 2009. And most data that is presented about the API community really presented in aggregate. So you can see in those purple bars, total Asian American homeownership rates held pretty steady at 59%. But if we dig a little bit deeper and look at some of the sub-ethnic populations, I've identified here in this chart those communities or sub-communities in which homeownership rates in just 1 year declined significantly. So in the Bangladeshi community, the homeownership rates dropped from 48% to 42% nationally. In the Hmong community, from 50% to 48%. That number is actually more stark in California for the Hmong community, where homeownership rates actually dropped 10 full percentage points from 38% to 28%. So clearly there is a different story that is showing up for us when we look at this data. Going to the next slide. So, census provides us with an imperfect picture, but it does give us a little bit of a glimpse of what happens among some of the different communities that are part of AAPIs more broadly. And it's also sort of reflective of a different kind of story than the ones that we hear from our local community members that are actually seeing families seeking services to support them in foreclosure or whatever other housing issue they need or are seeking services from. So because we lack other data sources, so we only know a little bit about homeownership rates, but we unfortunately do not understand sort of data about the types of loans that people are getting and loan performance by ethnicity, because such data by sub-ethnic population is not collected through the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act or HMDA. And so what we've tried to do in the past couple of years is worked with a couple of our community groups and sister agencies to push alternative research to help us to understand that picture a little bit more. So we worked with the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center to do some research in the Southeast Asian community in the Central Valley of California, and also Chaya CDC, one of our partners working in the South Asian community in Queens, New York. What we did is we basically looked at notices of default and identified using surnames that were easily identified as Southeast Asian or South Asian in order to understand what the foreclosure impact has been in those particular communities. And not surprisingly, we found that by looking at surnames that the percentage of APIs in foreclosure in Queens, for example, was much higher, probably double that of their relative proportion in those targeted zip codes. Additionally, we did some mapping of concentrations of APIs in neighborhoods that had high foreclosure, and also we found that that was certainly true in the Central Valley with the Southeast Asian community, where Southeast Asians were severely concentrated in neighborhoods with high foreclosure, which also indicated to us challenges for renters in foreclosed properties that also warrant a lot more attention. So clearly there is a need for more and better data to help us to better understand the nature of the problem, so that as we're working with policymakers, we can also help to seek more meaningful and targeted solutions. So on to the next slide. A big issue, as Bruce mentioned earlier, is the issue of language access for our communities, and something that we've been pushing really hard with a lot of federal agencies. And APIs have the highest rates of households with limited English proficiency. From this chart, you can see that 79% of Asian Americans speak a language other than English at home, and only 40% speak English 40% indicate that they speak English less than very well. And for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, that percentage is 15% compared to 8% of the U.S. total population. So clearly there is a huge need for culturally and linguistically relevant services overall, and in particular in the housing counseling space. But unfortunately, I think the capacity of local housing counseling agencies is quite limited. So national capacity, we became a HUD housing counseling intermediary only in 2010. So much too late in the housing crisis, but better late than never. And at the start of the crisis, there were probably only a handful of organizations that had, that were specifically targeting the API community. And we have been very successful at national capacity to grow our network from about 5 different organizations to 20 organizations in 14 different metropolitan areas, with the capacity to serve over 25 different languages and dialects. And so we continue to grow our capacity, but clearly more needs to be done. And and I think we look to counselors on this call to help us to broaden our reach and capacity. But in addition to housing counseling services, it's my belief that banks and financial institutions also have an active role to play in affirmatively meeting the needs of API communities. As it stands, existing bank strategies are inadequate and completely unacceptable. So banks clearly have been able to successfully market and sell mortgage and other financial products to the API community, however, have made little effort to provide the same level of services with their loss mitigation departments. So it would be like me buying a car at a car dealership, but the dealership not willing to help me if my car needed, if my engine needed repair. Banks have also often relied on the language line and other sort of phone interpretation services, which has been an okay solution. However, the accuracy of the translation is not monitored or regulated, and we have definitely heard stories of counselors that have needed to spend additional time with borrowers after a 3-way call with a language line interpreter, only to have to explain to, say, a Hmong client what they just heard from a Hmong interpreter. And of course, there is the ongoing issue that loan documents, disclosures, mortgage statements, and other notices are not being provided in language, even when contracts are often negotiated in other languages other than English. So this continues to be a problem. And sadly, the federal regulators have not actively made an effort to clarify what obligations financial institutions have to meet the language needs of borrowers. So I'm just showing you some pictures here. So I work in Oakland's Chinatown, and this is 2 ads from my local train station. So it's pretty clear to me that there is business to be made in serving and selling products to the API community. This is an ad, in Chinese. It's not for mortgage products, actually. It's for retirement services and children's savings accounts. But clearly the banks have the capacity to conduct translation and advertise heavily in API languages, but certainly more needs to be done to push these banks to provide fully the services and products that they sell to the communities for whom English is not a first language. So what can we do? And I'll just finish up really quickly here. So we're looking for opportunities to work with counselors in the field to better meet the needs of API homeowners and essentially all homeowners. So if you can go to our website on the next slide, you can go to our website, and there's a list of housing counseling organizations within our network with a list of the housing services that they do provide applied in the languages that they serve. So if you're in a local region and you have API borrowers that need additional support, definitely look to identifying an organization in your local neighborhood. And we also remain vigilant in protecting our communities that are interested in expanding their capacity. So we do have some resources. So here's an example of a loan modification scam alert ad that we translated into, I believe, Bangla. And there's other resources that are available online. Here I just pulled out really quickly. We've worked with the Department of Treasury in the past to translate some of their materials into Chinese. This is from their website, Making Home Affordable Materials. We also worked in the past with Freddie Mac to develop a curriculum called Credit Smart Asian that is also in language in Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean. And here you see an example in Korean. So as Bruce alluded to earlier, there's certainly a lot of advocacy opportunities on language access. I know that NCLC and the National Fair Housing Alliance have been working closely with the Department of Treasury to translate forms such as the RMA form. So they certainly advertise, they're making home affordable program in Chinese, but none of the forms are available in Chinese, for example, and also to work with Treasury to clarify their obligations through the HAMP program. And then, of course, there's the ongoing role of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We're excited that Director Cordray has finally been confirmed, and we continue to have conversations and want to work with all of you to help to collect more stories and identify where there are some potential joint opportunities for a campaign to sort of identify and elevate the issue of language access for the API community as well as other communities for which language is a barrier for receiving adequate service. So with that, I will end there, and if you have additional questions, you can ask them here or contact me at my email address, and also our website is there if you want more information about the poverty statistics that I identified. We actually have a full report that we released last month, and the full report is available on our website as well. So I'll turn it back over to Bruce.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's an area we're going to need to learn a lot more about, I think, as our populations change, and pretty interesting as well. See, we don't have any questions in the queue, do we, Matthew?
No, we don't.
Okay, great. Well, so let me move on quickly because we have one other area we'd like to talk about briefly, and this is something we've touched on before. Many of you took the our webinar on the AG settlement and using the servicing standards to get better resolutions for your clients. And even if you didn't, the checklist is now available, and the checklist is just a very simple mechanism where you can take any cases where you think there's been a violation of the servicing standards in the National Mortgage Settlement. You enter a little bit of information about your client, and then it's basically a ladder that you can check. You've got a concern here. It'll elaborate on what the possible violations are. You check the ones that are. There'll be a text box for you to fill in details. There's also a place to put in fair lending violations. And what will happen then is once you submit, that information goes into a database that we're working jointly with the National Consumer Law Center and to put together an analysis of what's happening and not happening on the servicing standards for the AG settlement. We will give that to Joe Smith's office. But it's also very important that after you've done the initial submission, you'll be asked whether you would like to also send this to the CFPB, to your state attorney general, to UMSO on your own, to the Joe Smith's office, and then if it's a fair lending violation, also to HUD. And what happens is that you can get your cases into the queue, and if you put a lot of detail into the text box, that's very helpful, especially for the CFPB. And these are complaints that we were very interested in trying to get into the system and figure out which ones are the most responsive. And we'll tell you when we're hearing which ones are most effective. so that we can start getting some better resolutions for clients. And this is all available. You can get to it on our website or go directly to the NCLC website. And that little red box that you see on your screen, that's the if you click that on our homepage on the NHRC homepage, that'll take you to the link for entering these. And we're working on polishing up an upload function for HCO and CounselorMax that will make it easier to do these in more in bulk. I know everybody's got very crowded on their time, and there's a lot of demands on their time. The value of doing this is that we're hoping that you will be able to get better resolutions, and we will also be able to use this data to say this is what's happening and not happening in the field. At the same time, we're pressing on a number of fronts to accomplish these kinds of goals, one of which is the OCC, who's the regulator of the biggest banks, and so not just of the ones that are part of the National Mortgage Settlement, but so many of the other large banks as well. They're asking to sit down with us to figure out if there's a way that they can get access to some client files that where we think there's been violations, and then use those to pursue what actually happened at the bank level, which we think will be able to more quickly identify where there are big problems. And this is a way of getting around this kind of, going in blindly and doing a random search. We're going to red flag certain files are going to be problems. Now we have to work out the privacy issue to all this, but at the point that happens, we'll ask you to give us examples of where there are problems and see if you can share client files that would be appropriate matches. So lots of stuff coming up. We had a busy call today. One more quick thing is that I want to just encourage everybody to think seriously about joining National Housing Resource Center. It is what keeps us going, and we want groups to be as deeply involved with the advocacy as possible. We're doing a lot of good work. There's a lot more to come. Next month will be our one-year anniversary, and we have driven in over $30 million in new housing counseling funding, but there's a great deal more we've got in the pipeline that we're hoping will play out around these kind of issues. You can still get the discount on the credit reports. We heard about an agency that's saving $200 a month on their credit reports because they're using our discount. We're eager to get more agencies using it because it's there for you to save money. Certainly if you have any questions, feel free to talk to me or Matthew to get more details on it, but it's a pretty easy sign up. It is signing up for a new provider, but it's a very legitimate long-term credit reporting provider, and they seem to be doing a good job. And there are other discounts available if you're a member, and there's then, of course, lots of resources on our website, and we're always interested in your feedback about how to make these work better. We will have another call in early August, and I think we may not have a late August call because our little test of checking out with other people the third Thursday of August, we'll test this a little bit more, but if there isn't enough, if too many people are on vacation, we may skip that one and dive in for September. But we'll keep you informed on all of it. Thanks for all your support. Thanks for all the good work we just did on the lost documents question and on the recent sign-ons. And we'll be in touch with you. Thanks so much. Bye.